Okay, my name is Louis Gross. I was born in Slovakia in a small town called Humene. I'm a child survivor.
In what year?
1938. Our town was a little, not really a village, but with almost 7,000 people prior to the war, or at the time that actually the Germans invaded Slovakia, around the time that I was born. There were approximately 2,800 Jews out of the 65 or 7,000 people, so that the Jewish influence in that part of the valley, this particular valley of constellation of small towns and villages, was fairly large. My father was a member of a large family who's lived in that area for a number of decades, actually probably more than a century, since my grandfather's father was even buried in the Jewish cemetery in Humene. He had 11 children, 7 boy children and 4 girls. 4 of the family survived and came back, including my grandfather, who was really, it's an amazing story, because when the transports and deportations were in their final phase, we were trying to encourage him, at least my father was trying to encourage him to come with us and run and hide. He said he was 74 at the time, that he's too old to run, and whatever God's will is, that will be it, and that he's just going to stay. Well, his employees, these were people who were employed in his and his partner's mills, because they were in the lumber business. And actually, the 2 partners employed probably at least 60% of the population of Humene in the mills. And a number of those employees were very loyal to him, since he was a very benevolent employer. And as a result, they started hiding him from house to house, keeping him one step ahead of the Nazi Guard, which were the Slovaks who were, in effect, in the German army, because there weren't that many German soldiers who were actually on site. They delegated most of their atrocities to the locals, who joined in, and some of them, or the part of the population that was ardently anti-Semitic. And they were also able to point out very clearly who the Jews were and who were not. But because of my grandfather's and my parents' and my father's relationships in town, there were some long-standing alliances that were established, and in this one, saved my grandfather, because he just stayed and put his prayer shawl on every day, and he said, whatever God's will is, it's what's going to be. And they hit him, and he survived the war. So when we came back after the war into our town, we were the most amazed people to see our grandfather present. So, you know, I guess God's will was to preserve him. The earliest memories that I have as a child were some very nice memories, because this family of 11 families that lived on the same street, and uncles and aunts, we actually were, the street's name was Stefanikova ulica, but they often was referred to as the Gross Street, because all of my uncles and aunts and cousins, they all lived on the same streets. And as a child, a little boy, I would run around from one aunt and one uncle, one relative to another, and I was probably adored by most, because I was a little gangster to begin with, and a lot of spunk. And I had a number of close associations, both with cousins, women cousins, as well as uncles that I particularly adored. And we would have lots of family activities in my grandfather's field of trees and corn and roasts and bakes and lots of fun things that stand out in my mind. And having the family being quite wealthy for the area, they also participated in going to all kinds of spas. And I still remember going to these spas prior to the deportation starting, when it was still safe to go and engage in those particular spas in Karlovy Vary, which is the equivalent of Carlsbad, in California. And they had all kinds of mineral baths for ladies of means to go there. So those were good memories. The memories that I remember of the Holocaust, the earliest memories, started actually with the transports. And one particular event that stands out is the beginning, kind of the end of...
I was going to ask you about your
childhood.
family, religious family, or
they were pretty Orthodox. So yeah. All the Jews were Orthodox. My grandpa had a long beard, and I always resisted having to have a big cap covering my whole head. And my mother was always sewing, nice little outfits for me, and Grandpa would always complain that it didn't cover my whole head. They only covered half of it. And little soldier's hat and other things like that. But
is there a lot of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, there was a normal amount of anti-Semitism, and we were still the people who killed Christ. In that era of the Pope didn't exactly reach Humana and tell him, especially in those days, that Jews didn't really kill Christ. So someone would say, well, good, let the Jews die, because after all, they killed Jesus. But most of the people, a good number of the people, were good people, and they, as a matter of fact, they saved my grandpa, so it's just a measure of the kind of risk some of them actually took, because they would have been immediately killed if they found out that they actually hit a Jew, and a Jew of that kind of prominence in this town, meaning my grandpa, or any of the people who were associated with my family. The first memory was really seeing the first transport, which was really the beginning of the massive deportations, which right after that we actually left Humana, was seeing a herd, a big group of elderly people coming right down our street and heading towards the station, which was not too far away from our home. This was called the smaller railroad station, right, where the cattle cars basically were all ready to put the people in. And I didn't see that part of it, but I just saw, and no one was allowed to get on the streets. The guard, the Nazi guard, the Slovak Nazi guard, was positions on the sides of both sides of the street while the transport of people was heading down towards the smaller station. And I had a nursemaid who made sure that I would not be on the street. So I kind of didn't understand what was going on at the time, and I ran out into the street without her catching that I ran out. And I saw among all the people one of the favorite people of mine, who was one of my best friends, Grandma. And she was limping greatly under the burden of, I think she had a limp anyway, but I think she was burdened by a bag on her shoulder and trying to keep up with everybody in the transport in this group. And so I ran up to her, and she gave me a big hug, and to take a minute. And, tears were flowing down her face. And I didn't understand why she was so sad. And I ran back home and got her one of my canes, which was called a Janoschek cane. it was kind of the equivalent of a Robin Hood. Januszek was the guy who would rob the rich and give to the poor, and he had like axes made out of wood, and so there were some canes made to look like axes that he would wield for children to have, and they were made into walking canes. So I ran in and I gave her the walking cane, and then I heard my my nursemaid Hanka yell, "Lajko, Lajko, where are you?" And this was my Slovak name, and came dragging me back into the house and not punishing me, but dressing me down for running out. Excuse me. And so that was kind of the beginning, and kind of the beginning of the end of all the good memories of my childhood. The next thing that stands out the most in my mind is a similar scene, not similar, but a similarly upsetting scene to me as a child. And that was when we were actually being smuggled into Hungary. There were people whose jobs were primarily to smuggle people out, and they made big money. My family, having means, was able to make use of these kind of people, and they took my mother and I and my two sisters to be taken to Hungary to my mother's sister, who lived in a town called Debrecen, because the word was that the Hungarians, that in Hungary the Jews were not going to be deported, which was obviously not the truth. And we were smuggled across in a cattle cart. In a horse-drawn buggy with hay, and we were hidden under the hay. And I sort of started writing one of those little episodes of how upsetting that whole thing was, because Father wasn't around. I was asking, where is Father? Why are we going? What are we doing? What's going on? And they just tell me, just keep quiet and don't make any noise, because it's important that you stay quiet so we can come to see Lenkenini, which was my mother's sister. And we did get across, but the guy who smuggled us across, I heard later, was caught on the way back, and it was found that he smuggled some people, and he was killed. At least that was the word that we got, and I was verified with one of my cousins that survived that was the truth. So we were very lucky again that we got through the border. And then, of course, after, I don't know, probably a few months of living with my aunt, the word came down that there would be transports in Hungary. And my mother was summoned to a Gestapo outpost, and her papers held up, so she was allowed to come back to my aunt's house. I want to add that one of the things that really helped us all survive is my father's. He was a very perceptive man, and he saw what was coming, so he didn't want to just sit there and not do anything. And he had, as part of how he occupied his time, he built his house. He built our house with a bookstore. We lived right across the street from a school, so he had a bookstore and stationery store and a print shop in the back of our backyard, which served the needs of the school. At the same time, what happened is that he had a number of people he trusted in City Hall, and they gave him some genuine seals, that he then started printing passports for the resistance. And really, this was the essence gave us some favor, with the resistance movement. This was actually the Yugoslavian partisan movement that started moving in that direction, that he was able to give some false papers with some genuine seals, which then carried us practically through the war and helped us on a number of occasions. One of those occasions happened to be when we were smuggled back, tried to get back into Slovakia after the transport started in Hungary. And we got caught in a town called Košice, which is the second largest Slovak town. And we were immediately sent to be interrogated by the Gestapo and taken into a large room where the guy behind the desk quickly removed his pistol and put it on the desk. And we were there with my grandmother on my mother's side, who also tried to come back into Slovakia come with us. We were all standing. I remember just hanging onto my mother's skirt, frightened, silly, that what is this guy going to do with the gun? You know, he put on the table, and he immediately said, what do you have in those suitcases? And mother proceeded to tell him what. And he says, if I find one thing that's not supposed to be there, you know, I'm going to shoot the children first right in front of you. Those were the words he used. And I couldn't, I was really just scared, silly, and hanging on. And I remember my mother's arm.
You were about 7 years old at that time?
At that time, this was in 44, I was about 6 years old. And in any case, they locked us up, and our name was Gresh at that time because the passport said Gresh. Gross sounded too Jewish. And I remember how, I kept remembering not to say gross, I have to say Gresh. Remember that, and also preserve that no one would see my penis either because I was circumcised. So in any case, they kept us locked up, and later I found out we were there for 3 days and without hardly any food. One day they came back and they opened the door and they said, we can go. Turns out that while we were locked up, they sent a messenger all the way to Humene, to our hometown, to verify our passports and whether they were genuine. And as luck would have it, the day the man walked into the city hall was my father's friend behind the desk. And they asked him, do you know these people? And he says, yeah, these are good Christians. They're not Jews. You should let them go. They were just visiting some family in Debrecen. And that's how we got out. That's how close a number of events that occurred throughout the time that we were on the run. From there, we started going from town to town. Again, my father was, connected now with the underground, and periodically he would come and see where we were at night to these various towns, Turchansky, Svetý Martin, I remember. One day he just showed up, and I remember I said, how come you can't stay with us? It was scary not to have father around and mother just lugging us along. And, he said, don't worry, everything will be fine. And he didn't give me any explanation. But I remember getting really upset and angry with him, that he wasn't there, to protect us, and that he left everything to mother. And, of course, mother she was a Wonder Woman. She knew how to do everything. And she sewed to get us some potatoes and other things too, livelihood, wherever she could. And we also had, later I found out, some gold that she was carrying as a means of trying to get more money. And again, thank God for my grandfather, that if we didn't have those resources and if they weren't hidden before we left and that nobody got at them first, we would have been long deported, and probably as children we would all be dead. So we actually went between 3 or 4 different towns, and I remember all these various places, and it's not that they were necessarily traumatic, they were just always the places themselves, but they were always upsetting because each time there was a moment's notice we had to move, and we had to pack everything up. To this day, when I have to go to a different place, I relive some of the anxiety of moving and change. It used to be a time that I could hardly get through a border like Canada because they smelled my anxiety, and they would always go and they would always go and check out all my suitcases. So I would always have my wife on my head and says, "You go ahead and you talk," because somehow these people were trained to pick up if somebody was looking a little uneasy or anxious. So those events, were stored, and each time there were a similar event in the present that would trigger all the other events like that and would bring shore into all the anxiety of the past, and even though there was no imminent danger in the present. The one prior to, you may have heard, or I'm sure the world has heard by now, that there was a period in time in 1944 where the Slovak resistance was trying to mount and get a rebellion against the Nazis, and try and get those Slovaks who were in the Nazi army to join in, and the Russian front was coming close to the area where we were living, and they were hoping that the Russians would surge in that direction and help the Slovaks to have an uprising. And we were in a town called Banská Bystrica when this was all going on, and we were right in the middle of this movement that was agitating and trying to get the uprising going, and they did. And of course, the Russians didn't do what what they promised to do. I remember some kind of a pass in the mountain that they were supposed to send a whole bunch of battalions to help with the work. They never did. And basically what it amounted to, that the rebellion was put down in less than a couple of days. And we were in the midst of that whole rebellion, so that the Germans brought in whole battalions of soldiers, and they wiped out practically every village that was anywhere near that whole area that was planning and agitating the uprising itself. So there were thousands of people that were just totally eliminated and wiped out. So once again, we had to run into the mountains, and the Germans came down en masse, with Stukas coming down and strafing the huge amounts of people right in front of us in this valley. And one of my uncles who was with us at that point, I don't remember how he got to us, but we were all running together, trying to reach the forest, because the valley was being penetrated with all these human elements, which some of them were the partisans and some of them were Slovaks who were trying to start with the insurrection. And we were just, remember my sister crying, "Soldier, soldier boy, save me, save me," while the Stukas were just coming around and mowing people down. And I remember running.
And where were you? Just on the outskirts of the Stukas coming in?
We were just in this valley trying to run for the forest, for the trees, because the trees would protect us, from the strafings.
Sure.
And we had quite a ways to go, and the bombs were starting to fall. One fell near my uncle, not too far away, and it never exploded. I mean, he was just lucky that it just was rolling down. And I remember running, and I fell into a cow dung with my face, and then quickly got up, and I saw a whole row of bullets behind my feet. It was that close, that things were, that life and death was, it was that easy, that fast. It could have, people were just laying, bleeding to death over there, and now there was a picking up and running. That was a massive scene where there was a imminent threat to life in the moment, that we all felt. And we made, my family, luckily, my mother and the three of us. My father was already, in the mountains, in the bunkers with the partisans, and then he came down when he heard what was going on, to try and get us up, but he wasn't there early enough for us to meet up with him. So eventually we got into the woods, and I remember it was pouring rain by then, and we made a makeshift lean-to with some bare essentials. And I remember my uncle was lost a big can of jelly that started rolling down the mountain, And my mother says, "Oh, Samuel, I mean, you lost a big can of jelly. I mean, how could you do that?" It was just clanking down making all that noise, and the rain was pouring down, and we were just huddled together to try and stay and preserve some sense of dignity in all this terrible, terrible mess. Then we were connected with the underground, and they had some makeshift bunkers, which also had supplies, and so we stayed in those until everything settled down back to the so-called norm, of the Nazi occupation. And it took another, I think, 3 or 4 days where we were in there, and then Father said there is some word that there are some Ukrainian bands, that are coming through the mountains. These were marauders, people who were just killing for the sake of killing and getting whatever they could. It had nothing to do with one side of the war effort or another. But the partisans were more afraid of them, and the small packets of resistance movement, because they killed everybody. So Father said, there's word that they're coming this way, so you better go down into the village. And we picked up, and Mother, with the 3 of us, started walking down, and again, turns out this was already starting to be really cold at that time. It was snowing heavily, and we made it down to the village, and apparently he prearranged with someone a farmer, to let us use his place, and obviously, he must have paid him. But money was usually it was food that really counted at that point, because there was no food to be had, and potatoes were big thing to have. Any kind of staple, bread and potatoes. In any case, we made it to this house, as I remember, and then we heard that this band did come through that particular area, and we didn't know whether Father survived or not. So we were thinking that maybe he didn't, because for weeks on end we didn't hear anything, and Mother was just walking around the village and asking for work. Mostly she did sewing for food, and our farmer also, she did some sewing for him. So he let us, he slaughtered a pig, and he let us have some meat. And I remember when nobody was looking, running into the kitchen and stealing a quick loaf of bread and stuffing it in my jacket, and then running into the woods and stuffing my face with it, and feeling so guilty that I didn't share it with my sisters. And these are funny things that stand out in my mind. And we were all in one room, meaning my mother and the 3 of us in one bed. And then one of our Christian friends somehow got to us a series of prayers that we had to study, Christian prayers, because I would stand in front of the cross and pray. When I mumbled, I didn't know the words, and I was afraid that the farmers' kids would find out, that I really didn't know what I was talking about. So every morning I would stand in front of the cross, and I would pray to the cross, and mumbled, and look at my mother to see, is it enough, or so on, give me the sign. And eventually I learned the prayer, because this lady sent us the prayers, and we studied every morning, and Mother was really proud of me because I learned the prayer, and I was really happy because I didn't have to mumble anymore. And then one night we got word that Father survived, and he was smuggled overnight into our house and up into the attic. He couldn't be seen. His feet were frozen, and he couldn't walk. So they took him up into this attic, and of course there was a risk, because any man a certain age who was not in the Nazi Guard was automatically suspect to either be in the resistance or being Jewish, and either one was, available to be killed instantly or hung in a moment, because those hangings would occur on a regular basis, and they would all have us come out and observe while they were, through loudspeakers, having all kinds of propaganda machines, and those were ongoing things. So it became, I remember as a kid, that I would see a guy hanging from a telephone pole, which was nothing unusual. Okay, there is another one, and I think about it now, would a 5 or 6 year old kid walk around the street not really paying too much attention to a guy hanging from a telephone pole? In any case, that's the way it is. That's the way it was. And when Father was brought in, I still remember feeling angry with him that he wasn't there to help us and to protect us. Because I always looked to him. I always thought of him as being omnipotent. Children see parents as being omnipotent, and they shouldn't have to worry about anything. And so when he came, originally, when I hid under the bed and I didn't want to talk to him. So he was trying to coax me out from under the bed, and he was hanging on a string a pair of favorite boots that I had that I left in that bunker because we were rushed to get out. And I remember telling Mom my favorite boots were there, and I don't have good boots now to run in the snow. And so he saved the boots. He brought the boots. I said, okay, maybe I'll talk to you now. In any case, we couldn't go anywhere, and it was really risky to have him in that house because periodically the patrols would come through, mostly the Slovak Guard, the Nazis, but after the insurrection, after the attempt of trying to, have the uprising, nobody was, they were just as bad as the Nazis, so, and they didn't want to say that they wouldn't do anything that would in any way cause anyone to feel that they're not loyal to the Nazis. Even though it was only about, I think, maybe less than a year before the end of the war by then. But we were liberated in 45, in April of 45, I think. In any case...
Who liberated you?
The Russians did. Okay. The Russians liberated us. So one day, Father was still in the attic with his frozen feet, and a patrol of three, I think they were Slovak guards, because they were, that's right, they were talking in Slovak. And they were coming towards the house, and this was a farmhouse. This wasn't like their houses right next to each other. So obviously they're coming to see our house, they're not walking out for a stroll. So in this case, when we saw them coming, when my family saw them coming, everybody got petrified. And I remember my sister, who was 6 years older than I was, she just froze. My middle sister was 3 years older, just got very panicky, and Mother really didn't know what to do. I mean, I remember her going around this way and going to the farmer and saying, are they coming here? And the farmer was really upset now because if they're he originally said he can only stay a few days because if they found that he was harboring, a partisan, they'd kill him too. So I saw them coming down the road, and I ran out the house and ran up to them and started jumping up on them and grabbing they had like automatic weapons, and I started, give me, in Slovak I was saying, give me your weapon, I want to shoot the weapon, and give it to me. And he says, get out of here. He says, I said, where are you going? Let's go over there, and I want to shoot the weapons. And I never shot a weapon before. I was saying all this in Slovak while I was jumping up and down on him. And they said, no, we got too busy. We got to go and check your house. I said, there's nobody in the house. Well, you have to check it. Let's go over there. He says, who's in the house? I says, just me and my sister. There's nobody else in here. And my two sisters and my mother. And my uncle, who's the farmer, he's out in the fields, I was saying. And he said, apparently they saw somebody from the farmer. They had outhouses, they didn't have regular plumbing in those. And this particular outhouse was built over a small river, not river, I mean a stream, a fast-flowing stream. So when you dumped, it was flowing down the stream. And this one kid just came out of the thing. I said, who is he? I said, well, he's he's my friend. He's my cousin. From the farm." So the three guys looked at each other and they said, "Okay, let's go down to the other farmhouse," and they never came in. So
You were a hero.
I never remember thinking about, to this days, I just remember, like, this is something that has to be done, and I probably was the least anxious out of the whole family to go out there and act like a child, and act like a normal kid would, for wanting. I remember how anxious I was at the same time, but I recall that nobody was doing anything, and that if nobody's doing, I knew they were coming, and they were coming our way. So when they left, I kept screaming, "Hey!" I kept running after them. I says, "Give me the push, give me the shotgun, and the automatic weapon. I want to shoot." I says, "Get out of here! Go back home inside."
You made a nuisance of yourself.
I made a real nuisance of myself, which diverted their attention from coming there and seeing that there is no sense going in there. This is just a regular farmhouse, and let's go down the other road and see if there's anybody hiding out there. Because there was another farmhouse, I would say about half a mile, quarter of a mile, half a mile down the road a piece.
Close call.
It was a very close call, and I think that it was a series of close calls like this, that really kind of many times over, that are kind of too long to even reflect on in one sitting. And that's part of the reason why I'm starting to write some of these reflections down now, because when I have time, I sort of think back to all these kind of specific things that, I used to kind of take them for granted. But they were all very lucky calls. So really the luck and help of some righteous people, and the fact that Father had an in, with the underground, and they were very active in that area. They were blowing up, at this stage, they were really blowing up a lot of, especially transportation areas like railroad depots and storage depots that the Nazis have collected, and now there was beginning movement in these areas because the Russians were moving up, and the war was coming closer to an end, in terms of where the Russians, not that they were the Allies. Our people were. Luckily, it wasn't the Russians that were liberating the concentration camps, because I'm not sure that they would necessarily help the Jews. It was, our people, our allies, who liberated most of the big ones in any case, that helped out. So, in any case, after that, we moved up to Turetska, which was another village way up in the mountains, where the underground was held up. It was a special place for them because they couldn't be easily occupied, and they couldn't. Vehicles, couldn't go up. They just had to go by foot or by a wagon, horse-drawn wagon. It was just a dirt path all the way up. It was a little village called Turetska. This was near the place where we were living, in a place called Stare Hory, which meant old trees, old forests. And since Father was in bad shape, we had to get him up there. So one night, the farmers, and they smuggled him and us all the way up to Turetska, and that's where we spent the rest of the warriors. Now, in Turetska, the underground was always in the open because we had a system of alerts to see if any patrols would come up. Myself and two other kids, from this village, our job was to herd the cows out on the slopes for feed, because the feed was hard to come by and no one was growing feed, so it always had to be, the cows had to be taken out to this pasture area. And from those points, our job was also to make sure that the buoys that were on flagpoles were always down, because if they started going up, that meant there's a patrol coming. And so we had like a dual job. Prior to one special event, things were fairly peaceful for us. As kids, we had We had, this was a small town, a strictly Catholic town. Of course, we went to Mass in the mornings, and now I was a regular pro at praying. So no one doubted how genuine we were. And periodically there would be a patrol that came up, but they, and all the partisans would fly off into the bunkers of them. And there was a system worked really well, so there was always plenty of warning because no one could get up faster. So everybody knew we've got 20 minutes before we go into the bunker. But one day we had part of the underground unit had all kinds of people in there. Russians who were shot down behind the lines and who then finally found the groups, and Romanians and people of all nationalities. They were part of Yugoslavians, Croatians, and Ukrainians, and Slovaks, and so on. And one day, two young Russians, by young, they're probably about 16 or 17 years old, from what I could gather later on. To me, they were just like two soldiers. Were joined with the unit. And they were new, and I remember my parents were saying, don't talk anything to them, and I said, they can't even talk Slovak, they were Ruskies. And an original member of this underground was a Russian captain, and he kind of, he liked me a lot, and he would mess around with me and play with me, and he would sing Russian songs to me, and I learned a number of songs, some dirty songs, that he would teach me. To this day, I still sing those songs. And I really liked him too, because he was fun, enjoying. And so he was one of my favorite people. And then when these two Russian kids came, he was occupied with them a lot. And I just remember, hey, how come you're not playing with me? You're just paying too much attention to those two. And so he laughed, and they were sent down to go down on the bottom to watch for patrols, close to where the buoys were. They would hoist as the first alarm system one day. And I remember I was on the slopes with the cows, with one of our favorite old people from the village who would always sit with us and tell us stories. And he would also carve. He was also a wood carver, so he was teaching us how to carve little figurines, and he would make little figurines for us, out of wood. And we really, or we would go and look for dry leaves so we could roll the leaves into cigarettes, and we would start at 6 years of age, smoking dry leaf cigarettes as big shots. And he would just say, okay, do whatever you want. And he was one of our favorite people. He was a wonderful old man. Tell us all these yarns and all these stories from way back when. In any case, I bring him up because this was an ongoing activity with him. It wasn't just when we went out to pasture. And all of a sudden we're looking down, and we see in the distance that the beginnings of some movement, of some patrol coming up. And patrols meant about 12 people, 6 to 12 people, would come up, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. But the buoys were not hoisted, and I pointed up to the old man. I said, no one's doing the buoys. So then he started running into the village and started among the, where the houses were, and started saying, everybody into the bunkers, everybody. I said, but there were no system. There were no buoys, because as soon as the patrol passed this buoy point, those two Russian boys just mowed them down and just killed the whole group. And of course, what happened after that, was hell. Because everybody ran into every time a group came up, they were starting then to say, now we're going to kill one person at a time, until we find out, where your people are, because obviously there are people here that shouldn't be here. Okay, so it started out, there were 4 different days that they would come up, and they started, and one of the first people they killed was our old man, and they made him dig a grave, and they made behind the church, behind the chapel, it was like a smaller church, they had him dig his grave, and they just came out, shot him. We had to all come and watch him shoot him. And I remember all of us wanted to just, they were kids, you know, they were there too. We just wanted to jump and kill him, and we were looking to pick up stones and start throwing stones at these killers. And then I know that there were 3 other killings because there were 3 other days, but Mother made sure that I wasn't around, you know, to see this. Anyway, that was very sad because even though, you know, they were not relatives, you know, they were people that were part of our kids' lives and activities and our little world, and especially the old man who really didn't deserve to die that way. And the others, I don't remember who the others were that they selected, but I think they started out with the elders first, supposedly doing us a favor. And they weren't killing kids, at least. But I remember Mother said, you never know what they're going to do next, so I was hidden under the bed in the room in case they came looking for something or someone else. Luckily, on the 5th day, they didn't come back. And that was already because the Russians, you know, were close by, and the entire Nazis movement, you know, Slovaks and all who were part of the collaborators and so on, were really moving out, you know, out of the area. And the last thing they were worried about is the little Turetska, you know, in the mountains. I guess this fell off.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I remember we were feeling very tenuous and tense about, you know, when they're going to come up next, because we didn't know what was going on in the world and where the Russian front was and whether we were close to being liberated. Anyway, shortly after that, we were liberated, and there was considerable joy, of course, and crazy captain, the Russian captain, found some German motorcycle, and he didn't know how to ride it, but he just picked up and rode it up the slope to our village, grabbed me and took me on a ride with, and Mother almost had a heart attack because she didn't know what was happening to us. Anyway, he was kind of my hero in a way, and the other Russians who came somehow were all of a sudden part of the unit. I guess there was some joining of other, you know, underground people. All they could do is ask for, would come up with string of watches, you know, that was the big status symbol right now, and they would say, "Davai chasi, give me your watch, give me your watch." And the more watches they had, the higher the status of each Russian was. I mean, stuff like that, which is, I mean, silly things that stand out in my mind. I said, why do you want all these watches on your arm? In any case, eventually that was the last really traumatic, really, and even then the luck would have it, we were able to survive. So luck was kind of what helped us all along, you know, in many ways. And then we started heading back, you know, to our hometown, and coming back to find who else came back. And of course, when we came back, we found out that very few of the family came back. And of course, then the Russians occupied the town, and they built
How about some of your neighbors that you?
They were all dead. They all died in concentration camps. There only 4 uncles, you know, 3 uncles besides my father survived. No women. None of the women survived. They all died. And my grandpa survived. And he died in 1948 of throat cancer, and he gave my father his prayer shawl, you know, that he kept wearing throughout the time that they were. This was not a Shabbos prayer show. This was his daily prayer show. He was buried in his Shabbos prayer show, but in the cemetery, you know, and I was telling you about that. We had to build a fence around now, but he, and of course, when my father passed away, he gave me the prayer shawl. So this is a special prayer shawl, and I found my son was married, you know, under that prayer shawl. That was the chuppah that he used. You know. And we also bless our kids on various holidays and occasions, you know, like Pesach now. We're going to family together, we all take the prayer shawl. So it's, on Yom Kippur, I pray in it one time. So it's kind of a special heirloom, you know, of the family. But that's the only remnant that we have left, you know, from the old country. Interesting part is that and the Russians wouldn't really allow people to emigrate, you know, or to leave, you know, just, you know, Jews couldn't move out. So what they organized, the escape route, the Aliyah, Youth Aliyah group, which was semi-underground, organized children to escape Slovakia and to emigrate to Israel, you know, when Israel was established. And the Russians would allow children to leave the country, thinking that parents stay behind, the children, and there were different things that they're going to a camp, they're going to different places, you know, different parts, and so we were able to cross the borders into Italy, and then we were in a United Nations relief camp. I mean, just one of my sisters and I, because this particular group, which was called Bricha, which was the escape route, Aliyat Noar, which was the youth Aliyah, and they brought us into Israel in 1949, where, you know, we were first in Ma'abarot in Haifa, which were the 10 cities, and then they placed us in various kibbutzim. One day I come back and Judy, my sister, was gone. I had no idea where she was. For 6 months we couldn't find each other. So, but we were well taken care of. The children were, you know, the Israel's backbone, and they took beautiful care of us. And just recently had a 55th. I mean, after almost 57 years, I was reunited with a friend from my kibbutz that I couldn't find for all these years. But that's kind of the general overview of our story and of our escape of the atrocities that the Nazis perpetrated on the whole family. No one stayed in Humenet. There's only one Jew left there now. We're involved in preserving the cemetery, as I mentioned to you previously, because now the city is 45,000 people. The Russians built a factory there, a chemical factory, and brought in a whole series of other population and built up a lot of places. Our home was knocked down to build quarters for the people who were working in the factories. My grandpa's and his firstborn son's homes are still standing, and they're beautiful homes. One of the homes is used as a nunnery. I mean, it was a huge house, and that was my favorite uncle's home, and he was one of the people that survived. So now his daughter married prior to the war, and he survived, and my uncle's daughter survived. She was one of the cousins that survived, and she had 2 children. So one of the children stayed with her in Slovakia, in a town called Košice, which is about 80 kilometers from Humenet, where we lived, and the other daughter is in Israel. So after the Russians left, you know, after the Russians were left Slovakia, we were applying to get some of the forests back, you know, that my grandfather and his partner owned. His partner and all his family was killed. And the criteria was that you had to live in Slovakia in order to apply for it. So my cousin's son he applied. We gave him the right of, whatever the legal terms were necessary to represent us, and he now runs. They gave us back about 75% of the forest because we had the deeds, and now he runs the mills that my grandfather ran all those years. So it's continuing, and he makes a nice living, and he also sends a little money from the extras that he makes, to the few survivors, So once again, we get a little extra something to remind us of what our grandpa did for us, and so that's kind of in a general way some of the story that we lived through, and we're happy to be in this country to be able to tell it.
When did you leave Israel, or how long were you
I
in
left.
Israel?
My parents never made it to Israel, so they made it to Austria and then Canada, and they insisted that we come and join them in Canada. And of course, we were big Zionists, and we didn't want to leave Israel, so we left Israel in 1952, and we were united in Canada. And then I moved with my parents in 1955. My parents always wanted to come to the United States, so my cousin's husband, the one that was killed, sent us visas, and we came to Chicago, and that's where I stayed.
That was with your parents?
I came with my parents. My sister stayed in Canada, and she married a Canadian guy. And my other
had two sisters.
I had two sisters. Yeah. My other sister married a boy from our hometown who survived, and they started a import-export business in Detroit, and they did very well. And so her son and her daughter are now one is continuing to live in the Detroit area, and the other's in New York. She died recently, my oldest sister. She died of cancer prematurely. And her husband also died of cancer 2 years before her. So that part of my family is gone. But my other sister is well. And she's living in Montreal with her husband and her two children. And they're all coming to Pesach this spring. So
that's great.
What a great family,
Yeah.
Another family reunion.
That's good. So you went from Canada to Chicago?
Went from Canada to Chicago.
With your parents?
With my parents, yeah. And then my parents moved out. They went back to after my cousin's husband was killed, and my father had a number of holdups, in Hyde Park. They said it's enough. He had a grocery store, and then he moved to Detroit, and he opened a children's store in Dearborn. Okay. And then they eventually got back to Montreal, and they lived out their years there. In Montreal.
That's where they passed?
That's where they passed away, yeah. So we were one of the lucky few that the whole family survived, and this was mostly due to my father's capacity to maintain the family under these kind of odds, and always moving one step ahead of the Nazis.
Incredible story.
Yeah.
So you met your wife in Chicago?
Chicago, yeah. And
you have children?
I have 3 children. I have 2 daughters, 2 of them, and 1 son. The daughter and son live in Chicago, and they have each have 2 children. We just had the newest addition, the first boy out of all the grandchildren. It's going to be spoiled rotten. And that's the girl that called me. That's my daughter-in-law that just called me earlier. Because she was saying that some of our friends here sent them a very sizable gift, and she wanted to let me know for the birth of my last grandson. And he's like 2 months old now. So we were just at a bris there recently. So those were happy events. And
that's good. We got about 2 minutes left. I just quickly a little bit about your professional life in Chicago. You went to school in Hyde Park or
in University of Chicago. I went to graduate school there, and I established, I worked for school systems for a while, and then I established my own private practice, and from that I developed a mental health clinic where we had a number of mental health sites throughout the metropolitan area. And then managed care is eventually eroded, our referral base, and we couldn't sustain to provide the livelihood for our therapists. So we essentially said we have about 3 years before we have to close shop. And that's exactly how long it took. And everybody found different work. And then I just decided I'm not going to start private practice all over again, and I'm going to retire. And I came originally to San Diego, and then from San Diego I came to Phoenix, and that's where I've lived ever since for the last 9 years.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
1 minute left.
Okay.
You did a great job.
Oh my goodness, did it take that long?
Great job. Yeah, I think we could. I can't think of anything else to ask you. I think you